Just after 5, and we'll get moving on the introductions. Thanks very much for joining us at this webinar. It's one of the regular symposiums hosted either in person or on Zoom by the University of Sydney China Studies Centre. You are encouraged to go to the Centre website to look for future events and also to see recordings of past events as well. It's a very full website that provides a lot of resources to people all around the world. Welcome. This particular session is on the 2 sessions that recently concluded in Beijing on March 13, and we've got an esteemed panel here to unpack the highlights of that meeting and probably to let us know that we were grateful we didn't have to sit through the entire several days of meetings, because I'm sure it was pretty painful for those who did have to. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll have not only a good idea of what happened in Beijing at that time, but also where China is heading for the future. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Footscray in Melbourne, the land of the Kulin people, and the people in Sydney are coming to you from the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. Our speakers include Minglu Chen, David Goodman and Wei Li. They're 3 academics from University of Sydney, so we get a great showcase of the talent that Sydney University has gathered over the last few years. Minglu Chen is a senior lecturer in the Department of Government and International Relations. Her research concentrates on social and political change in China, and particularly the interaction between entrepreneurs, business people and the state. And also she's got a recent expertise in women's political participation in formal and informal politics. She's published in prestige journals like China Quarterly, China Journal, Journal of Contemporary China, and her really fascinating book called Tiger Girls, Women and Enterprises in the People's Republic of China came out in 2011. Wei Li is has worked as a researcher on water conservation, renewable energy for the World Bank, the Chinese Ministry of Environmental Protection, and Renmin University in China. She joined University of Sydney China Studies Centre in 2011 and has held the Australian Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industries Research Fellowship before becoming a lecturer in international business. She's a core member of the KPMG Business School research team that leads Chinese outbound investors survey projects, the survey project for Chinese outbound investment. She also co-developed the KPMG University of Sydney database on Chinese outbound direct investment. She's going to speak to us on economics and today. And finally, we have David Goodman, who's Professor of Chinese Politics and Director of the Centre and at the University of Sydney. His recent publications include the 2-volume Class and the Communist Party of China, 2022. There were a few seminars that you can find on the back list of the website around that project, including all of the many of the speakers, webinars and these kinds of things. So it's worth having a look around if you're interested in the way class plays out in China, and also the Handbook of Local Governance in China. And some of you who have known David for a long time will know that he spearheaded the Provincial China Project, which was one of the first internationally to focus on China beyond the national level and underneath the national level to really look at what was going on the ground. And I think that's really where we're coming to today with our discussion on the 2 sessions. It's really important to pay attention to what's happening in China, what China's political leadership is saying they're going to do, how they present these policies, and it's crucial because it underpins global prosperity. We can't consider China solely through a security lens. If we do, we miss all of the important stuff. China's moving fast, it's changing fast, and much of this change occurs as a result of policy planning, philosophical or ideological considerations, and a coordinated action by the Chinese leaders at the national, provincial, municipal, and local levels. So China's way more than a security threat. It's a country that is not only working to enhance its domestic situation, but it's also currently reshaping in quite dramatic ways its international relationships. Big things are happening in China. We need to know about them. So the panel today will help us cut through some of the core debates that are taking place in China about its future and about its future social, economic, and political goals. And they'll do this by unpacking what happened at the 2 sessions. There's time for questions at the end of the 90-minute session. So please do put your questions into the Q&A on the Zoom, in the Zoom function, and I will pull them out when we get to the question time. So while much of the world was pondering balloons, China was getting on with business at the 2 sessions. So what happened in Beijing? So Minglu, before we get to what they actually did at the sessions, can you tell us very briefly what the 2 sessions are? We don't want to assume that everyone comes to the seminar with the same knowledge, so we'd like everyone to have that core understanding of the Chinese political structures from the outset.
Thank you, Louise. I'll try to be brave. I'll see how I do. Right? In contemporary Chinese political system, we have these 4 institutions: the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Government, the People's Congress at national and local levels, as well as the People's Political Consultative Conference, referred to often by the Chinese as the 四套班子, the 4 sets of political leadership. So altogether, these 4 institutions constitute China's basic political system. In its own words, the multi-party cooperation and political consultation under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's a lot to say, right? In reality, the functions of these 4 institutions are as such. The Communist Party, everybody knows, is the sole ruling party. The People's Congress, we can see it as the executive body of administrative work. The People's Congress, that would be the legislature, and the People's Political Consultative Conference, the PPCC, that's the advisory body. A little bit extra to decipher, but we can get to it later. So I think often when people talk about the 2 sessions, the Congress is often mistaken as the other Congress, which met last year. That's the Communist Party National Congress. So there are actually 2 congresses in China. Both are quite important, although a lot of people, when they talk about the People's Congress, as well as the People's Political Consultative Conference, these 2 institutions sometimes are kind of referred to or understood as the rubber stamp institutions. But I actually have a lot to say about this. The fact that we actually get together today, the 4 of us, talking about these 2 institutions, that means these 2 institutions have more than just rubber stamping decisions by the Chinese Communist Party. So according to the Constitution of China, the People's Congress is the highest organ through which the people exercise political power. Whereas the People's Political Consultative Conference, it plays a very important role in China's current political system. It basically functions as a united front work organization that really provides a channel to important social groups, such as members of mass organizations, selected members outside the Chinese Communist Party, as well as religious leaders, people from ethnic minority backgrounds, and those of various professions. Not every profession, but the key ones, private entrepreneurs, that's one, right? People from nowadays, currently there's a new category, which is environmental protection. So people who work in environment-related issues that are invited to be members of this category. So basically, in theory, People's Congress, People's Political Consultative Conference, they are institutions through which Chinese citizens participate in decision-making process in this country. But I think in reality, because the party controls these institutions through nomination predominantly, so access to political power, if there's any, is only available to selected members of the society.
Okay, wow, that's great. Thank you. That's very quick and very thorough introduction. Now, David Goodman, can I turn to you and say, why are there 2 sessions? You know, the National People's Congress and the CPPCC. Why not just have the National People's Congress? Why do you need this consultative body as well? Got to unmute yourself.
Of course, I have to unmute myself. Thank you. There are two reasons why there are two different bodies. One is historical, that when the Communist Party was successful in 1949, it had already set up the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference as the kind of to-be parliament for China. So it was the CCPCC which passed the legislation establishing the National People's Congress, which came into existence in 1954. Well, then you might say, well, okay, so you replace one representative body by another. Why not just get rid of the first one or the second one, however you want to look at it? And the answer to that is that whilst the National People's Congress is elected by representatives largely from the provinces and the PLA, People's Liberation Army, as I think Minglu Chen just indicated, the Jiangxie, the Chinese People's Political Conference, is a kind of representative body of functions and important groups in society. So all the other political parties have representative groups in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and so do various professions and occupations. And indeed, it's quite interesting that 3 new categories were added in the last round of state restructuring.
And what 3 were these?
I'm hoping you weren't going to ask me that.
Oh, okay.
My mind about. I was talking to Minglu about it yesterday, and I said one of us should find out what they are. So I apologize greatly to the audience, but they were, as I recall,
maybe someone can look it up quickly for us.
They were occupational groups, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, you should never do that. I always tell my PhD students, don't say there are 3 reasons and not what the 3 reasons are. Yeah, sorry.
Invited. Okay. Wei Li, can I now turn to you and so that you can bring in some of your economic expertise? China's economic growth is really closely watched by investors and businesses and governments from all around the world, because so much of our prosperity depends on China's progress. So what's the significance of the 2 sessions that we just finished when they announced a lower projected growth targets? Are there particular policies that they've announced within the 2 sessions that aim to boost specific sectors of the economy, or what can you tell us about the prospects going forward?
Yes, thanks, Louis. Yeah, you're right. So indeed, one of the most important announcements during the 2 sessions is the annual GDP growth target. And we very much are moving into these recent 2 sessions that we have. So they've announced that this year the Chinese GDP growth target is fixed at 5%. So just a bit of context, compared to last year, the growth target was 5.5%. So it is 0.5% lower. So indeed, a lot of people say it is a conservative target. One of the reasons being that last year, when they fixed the GDP growth target at 5.5%, in the end of the year, the real GDP growth was only about 3% growth. So their discussion about, the party and the government would like to be a bit more conservative in their prediction of growth. But also, I think there's some people are actually wondering whether the 5% is being too high or not, given the economic situation that we are seeing China is in. So in my opinion, I think it is achievable. Particularly, I think the reason is because if we look at what happened to the GDP growth rate in 2022 at the local government level. So what happened if we look back in 2022 is that the list of the last 5 provinces in growth rate, that means the one that performed the worst in GDP growth rate, is indeed a very unusual list. So what we see now, actually, these are places like Asialink was minus 1.9%, but Shanghai was minus 0.2%. And then we have Hainan, initially in 2022 had fixed a growth rate target of 9%, but in the end actually had a growth rate of only 0.2%, and Beijing as well, 0.7%, Tianjin only just about 1%. So what we're seeing is for 2022, majority of the provinces that perform really badly in their GDP growth are actually traditionally high growth provinces. And those provinces are mainly driven by manufacturing and consumption. And what we're seeing actually because of the lockdown and the restriction that have impact on these provinces in terms of their actual GDP growth rates. And the provinces actually perform quite well, funny enough, in 2022 are the provinces that are in central and western regions that are dominated by energy industry. For example, like Gansu had 4.5%, Shanxi 4.4%, and Inner Mongolia have 4.2%. So what I'm trying to say is that 2023, of course, marked the first year of reopening after COVID-19 pandemic. What we're seeing is a lot of the restrictions on manufacturing and consumption have been removed. So what I think is going to happen is that we're seeing some of the traditionally high growth provinces now resetting their growth target again at around 5% and 6%. So I think with a lot of those restrictions being removed, so we are likely to see that these provinces are going to achieve higher growth rates, certainly not what we see in 2022, that, basically going into the bottom of the list, but we're seeing these traditional high growth provinces going back to drive growth in China. So that's the reason why I see that actually 5% it is achievable. So it's not over optimistic that is likely to happen in China. So in terms of the, sorry, just one final thing, in terms of the boosting areas of the sector, I think what we've seen recently happen within the Chinese economy is that the manufacturing index, so what they call the Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, has actually rebounded quite sharply in February last month to 52.6%. That's a new high since 2012. It shows that the Chinese economy has signs of recovery, at least from the manufacturing sector. But I think what is the main concern at the moment for the Chinese policymaker is very much going to the consumption area, because there were some predictions to say that removing restrictions and retails, entertainment, catering, or tourism should really experience a very high growth. But that didn't happen actually over the last couple of months. So I think what we'll see in the next few months or in the year or so, there will be a lot of policies in terms of trying to support that consumption growth, particularly domestic consumption growth in China.
Yeah, interesting. I think a lot of governments got caught out about that. People actually got quite frightened to travel, didn't they? And got worried about spending all around the world after COVID. So yeah, stimulating that domestic economic growth is really going to take some effort. Now, David Goodman, many people have argued, just following on from this economic theme, many people have argued that the legitimacy of the Communist Party, especially since opening up and reform in 1978, has rested on economic growth. So lifting people out of poverty. So the Communist Party can continue to gain support for not be overthrown because it delivers economic growth to people, and that makes them say, okay, ain't broke, don't fix it. But what's often ignored, I think, in this narrow, it's only about the money legitimacy framing, are social policies that underpin that economic growth and make it possible for people to actually experience their lives as significant, as fulfilling. So can you tell us something about what was going on in the two sessions around the key social policy initiatives that maybe would underpin some of this domestic confidence building that Wei Li was alerting to? Were there any unusual or controversial policies raised? We're going to have to unmute.
I got it. There were definitely some interesting and controversial proposals that were raised. As you know, delegates to the NPC and the Jiangxia are both asked to, it's part of their duty to raise proposals. And I'll come to those in a minute. But what I took away from the two sessions this year were really 3 points. The first was that whilst the retirement age is going to increase, and that was discussed at the Central Economic Work Conference in December, whilst that's going to happen, it's going to be delayed pending feedback. And that's quite interesting. The pending feedback is really quite a strong theme to emerge from the social aspects of the Congress, not just over retirement. Also generally, Li Chang, the new premier, has talked at the end of the National People's Congress on the 13th of March and subsequently about encouraging bureaucrats to go down and find out what people really think. Get out of the office, he said. Go down and find out what people want. And by the way, there have been changes both discussed and implemented in the way that petitions are going to be dealt with in future, which is, of course, part of this feedback loop up to a point. And that leads really on to a third conclusion that seems to be very important to take from the two sessions, and that is the importance of local social governance. Now, what is local social governance? Local governance is easy to understand. It's where state and society come together at the local level. And Yu Keping, for example, in the first half of between 2010 and 2016, really talked a lot about China's local governance reforms being a major political reform after after reform and openness several decades earlier. But what local social governance is, which has been really introduced since about 2020, is, in one sense at least, a coming together of every aspect of society and government at the local level, government agencies, enterprises, both private and public, social units, housing units, all kinds of people, right? At the local level, under the leadership of the party. The local social governance differs from previous attempts at local governance because the party building is crucial to this. And all this has come to a head after the two sessions in the State Council, the Party and State institutional reform, which was announced a week after. In particular, there is to be a new department of the party called, in English, the Social Work Department. Those who have long memories and can remember Kang Shang may remember that starting in the 1930s, he headed something called the Social Work Department, which didn't have much to do with social work, but it certainly had a lot to do with social control. I think this is different, though, for reasons I'll come on to in a minute. There were, if we look at the documentation out of the Congress, the government work report, speeches by Li Chang, speeches by Xi Jinping, and so on, there's some really interesting things that emerge, as well as the controversial, the issues that you raised that delegates may have talked about, which I'll come on to in a minute. Let me just highlight a few of the things which talk to these 3 points that I've basically outlined in the first place. Before I do that, though, there is one interesting aspect of the government work report. It's very small and many people may have missed it. Li Keqiang, in giving the government work report on the 5th of March, said the gross higher education ratio, that's to say how many of the age cohort go on to higher education, has now risen to 59.6%. I think in his report he actually said, which beats the United States, which is only 47%. Well, that may be. Of course, in this context, higher education includes VOC-Ed, vocational education, further education, and so on. Nonetheless, it's quite an achievement. That's pretty good. Most of the other things in the government work report are things you would expect, dealing with the need to have attention paid to dealing with the aftermath of COVID, worries about home buying, graduate employment, which is unemployment, graduate employment it's called, but it's really graduate unemployment, which is severe. Making sure that there's no backsliding on poverty and so on. In the future, the emphasis is to be on more higher education, elderly care services, which is no surprise given the aging population changes in age, and green development, again, no surprise. Xi Jinping, when he spoke to the Jiangsu delegation at the National People's Congress, again on the 5th of March, as it happens, made some really interesting comments. Interesting to me anyhow, because I have an interest in local social governance. He not only emphasized the importance of local social governance, particularly in terms of party building, but also in terms of conflict resolution. And one of the ways he did this, which is fascinating, was to refer to the early 1960s model of the Fangchao experience. Fangchao is a village in Zhejiang, which was a model under Mao for the people themselves resolving conflicts that might arise. And it's come up in the last 2 years in other contexts, but here was Xi Jinping again talking about it. And he certainly, when he came to his final comments for the National People's Congress, he didn't mention the Fangchao experience, but he did say, he did emphasize the importance of making social governance, local social governance, more effective. He said, security is the, I'm quoting here directly in English, security is the foundation of development, stability is the precondition of prosperity. So you, Louise, when you introduced this, talked about how legitimacy economic performance was the legitimacy of the regime up to now. What's now being said, I think, is that stability is the precondition for prosperity. There's a different kind of legitimacy to just economic legitimacy. Just to come back to that question of what other issues were raised by delegates, since I don't want to take up too much time. Delegates discussed a lot about graduates needing to be employed. But some people also said, quite a few people actually said, well, at least they can have children, which of course is an antidote to the current lack of births. Another interesting, but not really controversial, although it would be very useful, suggestion that I noticed in the reports of the meetings was that some delegates, or at least one delegate, raised the issue that was then discussed by others about how ID cards, everybody of course has an ID card, how they could be used to ensure when you register an online presence, you are forced to use your ID card to do that in order to stop scams and that kind of thing. So you can see people are thinking about ways in which the kind of first world problems that China is now running into could be mitigated in China. Not a bad thing at all. A lot of talk amongst the delegates about how there are not enough women generally in positions of authority, but also in major research projects or in positions in the science, maths, and engineering side of the system. At the same time, people were talking about the need for women's legal rights protections. Those were all raised very on a large scale, of course. I think I might as well stop there. I have other things I can say later, but I'll stop there for the moment because I don't want to monopolize people's time.
But also you raised a topic that I'd really like Minglu Chen to speak about. You know, one of the core social challenges facing China is strengthening the roles for women. And, you know, like it's pretty serious all around the world, but in China it's no less serious, and particularly in formal politics. So can you give us some data about the numbers of women in the MPC, the CPCC, and how does this track from earlier sessions? And were there any policies that were being put in place to improve this? Basically to diversify the political class.
Yes, thanks, Louise. This has been as you said, my recent research interest. So I did pay quite a lot of attention to women in formal politics. So I have got a little bit of data here. So in this new assembly of the CPPCC, the 14th CPPCC, altogether there are 2,169 members. Out of these 2,169 members, 488 are female. So the National People's Congress, this new term of assembly has got altogether close to 3,000 delegates, 2,977 delegates. Out of them, 791 are women. So these numbers probably don't speak much, but when it comes to the percentage, about a quarter, I think less than a quarter, 22% of the CPPCC members are women. While it comes to the NPC, I think the gender ratio is slightly better. It's 26% of these delegates are women. So why does the NPC fare a bit better in this front? I think this is because the NPC, strictly speaking, is a representative body. So therefore, actually, at every level, there has been some quota system introduced. So the quotas really of deputies or delegates are about the size of population of every jurisdiction at the provincial level that gets represented in the NPC. So also the population of ethnic minority groups are taken into consideration. So outside the provincial level constituents, also there is a quota set aside for PLA members, soldiers. So other than this, I think kind of loosely quotas exist for certain groups, such as women, such as manual workers, as well as peasants. But I think the language has been rather vague. Since 1988, for example, let's take women, for example, since 1988, the 7th National People's Congress has put in a formal requirement to request the percentage of women should be higher or no lower than the last term. So I think this has been kept, right? Since 2008, there has been a kind of a more concrete quota for women to be represented in the NPC, right? So the quota is, somehow they came to this number, which I don't quite understand, 22%. So I think probably before 2008, the number was probably just a little bit higher than 20% or something. That's why it's rounded up to 22%. So the combination of this minimum representation of at least 22% plus this regulation of every year it has to be, every 5-year term, it has to be a higher percentage of women represented than the last term. So altogether lead to, since 2008, every NPC has seen a historical high of women represented. So this year, as I think 5 years ago, is the same, right? Women has reached the historical high of 26% in this important assembly. But that's actually not something for us to really cheer about. I think when we look at the decisions, one of the important things that drew attention to these 2-session meetings is this is where the state leaders are elected. So last year we have seen how the the Communist Party's National Congress has kind of got together, made the decision to elect a male-dominant, males-only Politburo, the highest governing body. This year, I think the outcome of the NPC election is not so bad, right? So it has elected a state council with 10% women representation. So 1 out of the 10 state leaders. So that is among the premier, the 4 vice premiers, as well as the 5 state councillors. There is one female figure who is Shen Yiqing, who is now one of the 5 state councillors. So it's looking better than the party side, but I wouldn't say this is a progress, because we all remember how in the past there had always been one female member in the state council, but put on a higher position. Sun Chunlan and Liu Yandong both served as vice premiers. That's one step higher than Shen Yiqing, and both the previous figures served in the Politburo, whereas Shen Yiqing doesn't have that important power from the party side. So I just focus, like following on what David was saying just now about members' proposals in these important political assemblies. I also had a look at, so once these women members, delegates are appointed to these important gatherings, what do they care about? So do women care about women's issues? So I have put together, because this is hard to find this data, this NPC and CPPCC do not publish their proposal titles in a very transparent form. So I had to gather the information from everywhere. So I looked into the CPPCC proposals that I could find, right? Altogether, I have a list of a little bit over 140, I think 142 proposals. About 10% of these proposals came from a woman. So what do they care about? I think only 2 of these 10%, or about 10 women, actually talked about women's rights, right? What kind of rights? Basically, women's rights in the workplace. I don't know. Maybe the source of my research is limited, so I haven't seen any open discussion of women like representation in formal political leadership. Instead, these 2 female members, they talk about gender discrimination in the recruitment process of workplace. They also talk about more support should be given to female agricultural workers to try to help boost agricultural economy in China. So I also looked at these 2 female members who are the only ones who actually cared about women's rights in this assembly. And they both belong to the one category, which is Women's Federation. I don't think this would be a surprise to you, Louise, because you have done so much work on, right? Really, Women's Federation has been the major driver that has shown agency in promoting women's rights in this, I think it's hard, that very sad patriarchal institution. I think I just stop here. I can keep going about women.
Yeah, both of us could keep going on this topic for a while. We know that not everyone in the audience is interested in the fact that, you know, women hold up a quarter of the sky, not half of it. Minglu, while I've still got you on, can you tell us about some of the international affairs aspects of the 2 sessions? You know, this occurred at the high point of the Balloon Gate and the AUKUS Circus. So did any of the sort of international stuff come through in the 2 sessions that we just saw?
Yes, in a way, the international stuff did come into the 2 sessions. So if we look at Li Keqiang's report on behalf of the State Council, under his leadership, he actually talked a lot about the importance of attracting foreign investment, the importance to solve problems that foreign companies face in China, how important that the Chinese economy has to rely on a global market, how important international cooperation in all areas are important for the Chinese economy. So I think, like, to summarize, he did talk about international affairs, but only focusing on the economic side of things. There was no mentioning of security-related issues. But this is because I think military has, the structure of the Chinese party-state institution has deliberately kept the military out of the government's jurisdiction. I think a lot of people here has more authority to talk about this issue than me, but just a very quick summary. I think my understanding is all these defense security related issues actually are looked after by the military commission, right? Which is, it has got two names, the Central Military Commission of the PPC, CCP, and also of the State Council. The two names referring to the same institution, which means in reality, the State Council does not have any control over the PLA, right? Then the Ministry of Defense, which kind of belong to the State Council system, is first led by PLA leaders. Also, it really in reality carries out out-facing functions of the military. So basically foreign related activities facing foreign delegations and all that. And also they are in charge of news release for the PLA. But when it comes to the control of the military forces, that is out of the realm of the State Council.
Okay, great, thanks. Wei Li, can I turn to you now? Because I think a lot of people will be interested in learning about the developments in the technology and innovation sector that emerged from the two sessions. Last year or the year before, we saw the tightening of regulations over the tech sector, and many commentators said that these new regulations had spooked the sector. And what does the two sessions tell us about the future of technological innovation in China? I mean, it's the hottest game in town with AI and everything,
Yes, I think one of the things is that looking into this year's two sessions, what is underlying the two sessions is I think there's a clear understanding on the Chinese side that there are major economic challenge facing the Chinese economy. So even though that now, they are removing restrictions related to COVID-19, factories are back to work, and this consumptions are slowly picking up. But I think the underlying challenge within the Chinese economy still remain. And these are the two challenges. On one side, it will be related to the US-China strategic competition. I think there's ongoing challenge coming from that space. In one area will be related to the technology decoupling. So this is ongoing that we're seeing a lot of recent news, particularly happening on the US side, about actually in certain sensitive technology areas where US companies are not allowed to supply to Chinese companies, but also increasingly their push towards US nationalities are not allowed to work for Chinese companies in sensitive industries as well. So I think the technology decoupling is going to take place, driven by the US-China strategic competition. And the other thing is, I think on a broader sense, that what we're seeing is in developed countries, particularly, there's a trend of removing China from the supply chains. That means, under the umbrella of either supply chain resilience or supply chain diversifications, but underlying what is happening is very much removing China from the supply chains, particularly in sensitive areas as well. So this is one major challenge. I think it's underlying a lot of the discussion in the two sessions, at least from the economic perspective. The other challenge, of course, is what we also seeing happening in China is about the population issue. That is a very major issue now in China. That as a consequence of that, what we're seeing is labor costs is increasing in China. But also, I think underlying it is that demand for real estate is not as strong as what it was before, right? Partially is people argued because of, investment return is low, but I think underlying it is because of when you have smaller number of populations, then the underlying demand for real estate will be weaker in the long term. So what we're seeing in China is, yes, you're right, there are a lot of the technology companies are facing challenge, but also small and medium enterprise, particularly those export-oriented companies when developed countries are removing China from the supply chain. I think they face a lot of challenge, but also the real estate companies as well. So a lot of the companies I spoke to, I think they seeing that, you know, particularly for last year, that the growth rate was not very promising. So then come back to your question, I think, Louise, related to, you know, technology and innovation. So is there any actually positive areas where China would be actually looking into in terms of growth? I think one interesting actual research I like to actually point it to is, I think I shared with people before that was from the Huron Research Institute. So they actually, one thing they did with the 2 sessions is that they're looking into who are the entrepreneurs actually made it into the representatives to the 2 sessions. So based on their statistics in the latest 2 sessions, there are in total 81 entrepreneurs. And these are people with total wealth of over $1 billion US dollars have made it actually to the 2 sessions, including 41 are the representatives to the National People's Congress and another 40 to the People's Political Consultative Conference. But what is quite interesting from their research is actually they're looking into the background of those local entrepreneurs, what areas and sectors that they're in. One thing was quite obvious is that there are some people that actually didn't make it to the list. And particularly these are entrepreneurs in the sector of internet, e-commerce, in the sector of real estate, and also, funny enough, in the sector of education. So we have these very famous entrepreneurs, for example, Ma Huateng, who are the founder of Tencent, Ding Lei, founder of NetEase, and Li Yanhong, who are the founder of Baidu, and Liu Qiangdong, all left. So basically, they didn't make it to the list. So that tells you in some areas what are the technology or within the technology and innovation sector, probably we're going to see quite a bit of challenge for internet, for e-commerce, for real estate, for education, right, related technology and innovation. But then the other interesting thing is looking into who are the new ones made it into the list. And these are particularly entrepreneurs coming from new energy vehicles, pharmaceuticals, and also artificial intelligence. So I think one of the high profile one was He Xiaopeng. So he's a very successful entrepreneur and best known for co-founded companies, including XPeng Motors, which is an intelligent electric vehicle manufacturer in China. And then we have Tang Xiaou, who used to be an academic, who is still a professor of information engineering at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. But what he did very successfully is now he's a billionaire and he's a computer scientist, and he founded SenseTime, which just went through, I think, an IPO, and is an artificial intelligence company. So certainly I think there are areas within that technology and innovation space where probably those areas are less of an emphasis for the Chinese government, but particularly I think e-commerce, people would argue what happened to Alipay or Alibaba was related to antitrust, anti-monopoly kind of consideration. But certainly I think a lot of the new focus will be on new energy vehicle, on pharmacy, and also pharmaceuticals, and also on artificial intelligence. But what is happening, I think, in general in the technology and innovation space is what I can see, certainly there's more and more emphasis on China should be leading in technology and innovation. But what is different from before, in short, I think, is before there were a lot of emphasis on technology, just being, having that technology is quite good. But I think recently there are more and more discussion about indigenous innovation, which means whether this innovation take place in China, whether it is supported by the Chinese supply chain, whether it it is also supported by the Chinese team, that are based in China. I think that innovation that is indigenous becomes very important now for Chinese companies and Chinese business. The other thing, I think the overall digitization is to driving, the innovation and technology space, probably a bit far away from, moving away from the traditional e-commerce type of digitalization, which is very much just focused on, selling to consumers, right? I think the digitization at the moment in China is moving a lot more to the business to business side, which means you'll be still seeing a lot of emphasis on industry 4.0, which although it's not been publicly discussed so much, but I think at the firm level, at the business level, there's a lot of focus on automation, digitization, and upgrading manufacturing capacity in China. But also the other thing about the big data, which is linked to artificial intelligence. I think that's the other area where China is saying that it is very important, not just from a business perspective, but also from a strategic perspective as well. Very important for China in terms of its competitive in the world. But finally, of course, besides the indigenous innovation, digitization, I think the other area that actually would drive innovation and technology in China, which companies are talking about it a lot, is the ESG, the green side. So there's enormous amount of push, I think, not just from government, but also from the party as well, that I think this carbon neutrality, decarbonization is increasingly seen as something that is driven by the party, that is also being recognized by business, but also banks, investors in China as well. So I think that green will be another theme within that technology and innovation space that would drive, these areas to attract investments and opportunities in China.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, it seems like on one hand, we've got this decoupling. Everyone's going back into their bunker, like trying to, get China out of their supply chain or prevent their stuff from supporting Chinese innovation. And China's going in for an indigenous mode of innovation. I mean, we could end up missing out on really good ideas because of the lack of communication, the lack of sharing of knowledge. To me, it sounds really tragic. But just while I've got you on this economic and international angle, you've answered some of this already, but I'll just give you another chance to flesh it out. China's the leading trading partner for many nations, including Australia. So can you tell us about any of the future plans for managing international trade that came out through the two sessions, including things like tariffs and intellectual property issues? What should Australian exporters be considering in their collaborations with Chinese partners? I mean, obviously, if you're into chip smuggling or something like that, you're probably going to be making quite a bit of money. But, if you've got a legitimate business, are there opportunities on the horizon for Australian businesses?
Yes, indeed. Or lobster smuggling, I think, have been doing quite well also over the last few years. But anyway, I think, yes, that's a fantastic question. I think related to that, I actually see there was one question from the audience talking about Li Qiang being now the Premier of China. I think one of the things is probably that not being recognized so much in the two sessions, but also in the leading up to the two sessions, is that there's actually quite a strong signal that about China's position in the world, which is actually China would like to continue to open. So that was actually featured even by Xi Jinping after the Party Congress. He said that China cannot leave the world, and the world also needs China. But I think what has changed actually over the last probably couple of years is that my research mainly goes into Chinese outbound investments. So I've been looking into a lot of investment made by Chinese companies into not just China, into all over the world. So I think what has happened probably over the last couple of years, but also in the future, is that probably within China now, there will be a stronger emphasis about FDI again, which means investment going into China and attracting particularly high quality, high technology investment going into China. I think that's where Li Qiang, one of his successful cases when he was in Shanghai was he was leading the discussion with Tesla and setting up their gigabyte factory in Shanghai, and that was one of his highlights of his career in Shanghai. So I think that his background in terms of working with foreign investors and his background into actually make sure that actually complex issue can be solved and investment can take place is probably his core capabilities, because I think, again, Tesla's case, if I don't remember it wrong, it was the first actual automobile manufacturing in China that actually go with a foreign wholly owned rather than have to go through a joint venture mode. So it actually managed to break a lot of the traditional, rules and consensus in that areas, and she makes sure that in order to attract, again, very high-end companies like Tesla, that they are able to make concessions and everything. So I think that's where I think that China will continue to open, and also China will continue to attract investment, particularly high-end investment into China. Then your question is actually very much related to trade. That means what would it sell, right? So I think if we're looking into how foreign investment in the past have facilitated trade from China, that traditionally was a bit more on the low-end manufacturing, and then a bit more sophisticated, but into machineries, into some electronic products. And now seeing China is going to continue to attract foreign direct investment, but in the high-end areas. And that's, I think, what we're seeing in some of the trade figures. I think there's lots of discussion about, containers numbers have drops coming out of China. I think one of the interpretation could be that if now China is moving away from low-end manufacturing and mass production, but focus a lot more on high value-added manufacturing. So I think what we're seeing in China is that will be trade continuing, but certainly a lot of the low-end trade and trades that are involving environmental protection, pollution, and trade that involve low-cost labor. Those are the things probably we're not going to see so much happening coming out of China. So I think even in terms of how we interpret trade statistics coming out of China, that needs to be updated, because certainly I think China wants to see, at least from an export perspective, more focus on high value added commodities and goods that are manufactured in China. And then in terms of countries, I think that certainly China is expanding its reach into the world. Traditionally, we know that it was very much focused on Western markets in Europe and also in America, Australia, but increasingly I talk to a lot of Chinese companies that going into actual emerging markets, developing countries, linked to the Belt and Road Initiative. That's certainly something that is not just driven by investment, but also underlying it's about trade as well. Back to Australia, I think funny enough that even though we had a lot of disputes with Australia had a lot of dispute with China, over the last couple of years. But if one look into the trade figures, actually, particularly Australian export to China has not been affected so much in terms of total volume. Actually has increased, certainly not decreased dramatically. I think partially is because of our mining and mineral export to China, which is very important, but also I think people didn't realize that the supply chain related to mining and mineral export to China was built over 2 decades. So it was not something that all of a sudden 1 year we build a supply chain and then next year political relation is not good and then it has to be basically just we find another one. So this supply chain have been built actually over the last 2 decades, and that's something that I've recently involved in the research that looking into a business ecosystem. That means that the interaction in the mining sector between Australia and China is not just two business doing, transaction work, but is supported by a range of stakeholders that not just central government, but also local governments, local NGOs, local industry associations, local suppliers, and the suppliers of the suppliers. So it's very, very sophisticated actual ecosystem that are underlying that huge amount of trade volumes between Australia and China. So I think that's where that diversification is never going to be very easy. I think a lot of Australian businesses are struggling still quite a bit. I mean, even including our education sector, that is still an ongoing kind of effort. But I think that's because, again, in the education sector, there's ecosystems that are supporting, why this Chinese student would like to come to Australia, right? It's not just because, we just seen as friendly country, but also people come to Australia for a holistic purpose for a range of reasons. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, yes, so trade, I think that it will be rather stable, what we're seeing between Australia and China, because the complementary between each other, but also that underlying supply chain has been built over a very long period of time. With investment, of course, I think related to all the decoupling discussions, but also related to the overall risk of investing for Chinese companies to investing in developed countries. So we'll see some impact on the investment side, but on the trade side, I think that so far what we don't see much is that trade has been impacted too much by the bilateral relations between the two countries.
Thanks very much. It's really interesting. We're coming up to 6 o'clock. We're actually just over 6 o'clock. So I'd like to, just to close, I'd want to use my prerogative as moderator to ask David Goodman about the role of philosophies in the planning and policies that we see rolled out at the 2 sessions and the Party Congress. So many people scoffed at the Belt and Road when it was announced, and we had to eat, and then had to eat apple pie as all the ports, railroads and roads were built across Eurasia and Africa. And we saw the same scoffing around the term common prosperity when it was announced. Now, sometimes it's a matter of language. These things don't translate particularly well into marketing spin in English, and the words and slogans just sound really awkward. But at other times, I actually just worry that people outside of China don't take Chinese things seriously. It's kind of a hangover from Orientalist thinking that denies the possibility that Chinese might think creatively and do something really innovative. And I just, I'd really like you to unpack for me a little bit, what's the connection between the ideas of common prosperity and the policies that were being rolled out or at the 2 sessions?
Well, I can certainly do that. And I can agree with you to some extent that there's a misunderstanding about what we might call sloganized concepts like the Belt and Road Initiative and indeed common prosperity. Why people think they're sloganized is because the way the party works is it announces a broad, far-off goal, no detail, and then the detail comes through working out in practice. And the party's always done that. So the Communist Party of China, even before it was the ruling party. So that's the way they do things. In this particular case, common prosperity is meant to increase people's standard of living. The emphasis is on the prosperity rather than on the common, because one thing you can be sure of is if these policies, which I'll spell out in a minute, are likely to work, it will not be common, because the emphasis is on the local, and the economic geographies that are around China are not equal. So you're not going to have common prosperity, but you will have increased standard of living for everybody. Now, there are really, I think, 3 problems that local communities everywhere in China have. One is there isn't enough health and welfare, education and health spending? No. Secondly, for the country as a whole, there isn't enough domestic consumption. And that, as opposed to investment in housing and so on, that was stressed hugely through the Congress. And the third one is local government doesn't have any money. So one of the things that the Congress did, which is where you would normally go to fund these activities, local government, what the Congress did was to say, we will increase central government transfers to local authorities so that something like a half of all money will come from, of local government money will come from, just from transfers. That's before you start talking about anything else. Now, all that's okay, but how does that relate to what I was talking about, which is local social governance? Well, the answer is local social governance, in some sense, is meant to be the solution to all three of those problems, at least to the problem of where do you get people to stop, why do people not spend on domestic consumption? They don't spend because they're having to save for their old age, and they're having to save for their children's education, and they're having to save in case they get ill in the meantime. So you need more money going into that in order to increase domestic consumption. It's blind Freddie could see that. So local social governance is bringing together entrepreneurs who have essentially revenue generating activities at local level, often from entrepreneurs, but not solely from entrepreneurs, that will come together and will provide, at least in some ways, possibly philanthropy, that's unlikely to be the end of it, mainly through taxation, I suspect, in the long run, more wealth at the local level that provides services at the local level. And that's why local social governance, that's the link between, of course, common prosperity and local social governance. And in case you think I'm making this up, this is exactly what Xi Jinping spoke about at one of the delegations he addressed at the conference, at the National People's Congress, I beg your pardon. So yes, will it work? Who knows? Is it daydreaming? Perhaps a little, but it is a possibility. And of course, what really needs to happen is a major reform of the tax system. Let me just give you a statistic which will chill some people. Government revenue in Australia raises 47–48% through personal taxation. Government revenue in China raises about 6% through personal taxation. There's something not happening in China that should be happening. That's income tax, right? But then there's wealth tax too. Huge amounts of money go into property. It's not taxed. There's no asset tax. There's no wealth tax. The government has tried, the party state has tried over the last few years to experiment with property taxes. Nothing is doing. The middle class kick back, and not just the middle class, of course, is largely not, I don't think, an autonomous middle class. It's part of the party state. It's a part of the elite, in a sense, certainly a minor part, but nonetheless. And so there's a whole lobby which will stop this happening. And, that's just part of the story. And common prosperity is really linked to local social governance. Many people will tell you that nobody is talking about about common prosperity. Yes, they are. Xi Jinping and the party people talk about common prosperity all the time, and it was very much featured at the party congress. The people on the state side, the government side of things, don't like to talk about common prosperity for reasons which may be fairly political and obvious, which is they don't want to scare the private sector too much, about which we haven't spoken very much tonight. But they're meaning the same thing when they talk about local social governance. This is what it's all about, in my view, and I think there's evidence to back that up.
Okay, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you all very much for the discussion. We've got 20